when the gallery owner became invisible, no one noticed. There were no announcements, no formal resignation, no controversy. Like the quiet moment, like the shadow of a man slipping away from the very wall he once built with his soul. Ethan Rowe, the founder of Lumen Gallery, a name that once stirred the heartbeat of New York's art world, slightly brushed the brass handle of an exhibit room he had once designed with his bare hands. But this time, that gentle touch triggered a scolding. A security guard, stern-voiced and cold-voiced, stepped in immediately. "Please don't touch the gallery area while visitors are still present." It wasn't loud, but it hit with the sharpness of a blade to the chest. It wasn't a reminder. It was a verdict. A silent sentence that erased him from the very world he had nurtured, through sleepless nights, through hands covered in paint and worry, through years when art wasn't an asset, but a reason to keep breathing. 1 year had passed since heart surgery forced Ethan to walk away from his role as director at Lumen. Since then, the gallery, once the gleaming heart of the city's creative soul, had fallen under the control of others. People who spoke in numbers, not colors, who pursued strategy instead of vision. Financial reports boasted that profits had tripled, yet the list of newly featured artists had all but disappeared. Ethan didn't call for a meeting. He didn't send a single email. Instead, he quietly borrowed a maintenance uniform, gray and worn with a crooked badge that read Tommy L in smudged ink, and wheeled in a cart of glass cleaning supplies through the very doors that once bore his name. No one recognized him. No one cared. He was just another part of the background, something to ignore. Golden light streamed from above, dancing over artwork hung like verses of poetry suspended in space. But in that silence a voice snapped sharply through the air. No one is allowed to touch the gallery floor during viewing hours. Ethan turned, still holding a feather duster. The man speaking wore a spotless black suit, a crisp shirt without a single wrinkle, and a smile edged with disdain. Miles Danner, the new chief curator. Once a young intern who looked up to Ethan with admiration. Now he stared at his former mentor as if he were an intrusion. "You really don't belong here anymore." Those words didn't simply imply a procedural mistake. They delivered a final blow to Ethan's existence in the very world he once created. This was the man who had once borrowed the attic of a dusty old library to host the very first exhibition of unheard artists. Now, standing among paintings priced at hundreds of thousands of dollars, he was no longer seen as a visionary. He was a blemish, an eyesore, an unwanted echo in a space that had been sterilized by money. Moments later, while wiping down a hallway near the logistics office, Ethan paused. Through a slightly cracked door, he overheard what he first assumed was a routine meeting. But then, the truth hit. "Raise the price on that piece to 90 grand. Tomorrow. The Zurich investors will buy it back at 130. Just list the artist as NJ. Makes it sound European. Sophisticated." A chuckle. Then a colder voice chimed in. "What about the Academy student submissions?" "Toss them. Not vibrant enough. Those kids don't understand what collectors are looking for." Ethan stood frozen. The plastic bottle of glass cleaner creaked in his tightening grip. He wasn't just hearing betrayal. He was witnessing the rewriting of art itself. A new system. A new language. One that didn't care for brushstrokes born of soul and sacrifice. Only for strokes that looked good in portfolios. Only for names that sounded expensive. The pieces once painted in quiet corners by artists who poured their truth onto canvas were now being erased. Not for being unworthy, but for not being marketable. And for the first time, Ethan saw not just a corrupted gallery, but a machine. Cold, clinical, polished with false purpose. Art had become a product, and artists, casualties. He walked slowly, almost reverently, pushing the cleaning cart toward the narrow service hallway, where unfinished paintings lay quietly on open racks, waiting, perhaps in vain, for their chance to be seen. The air was thick with the scent of linseed oil bleeding from the canvas frames, merging with the sharp, sterile bite of chlorine from the cleaning solution, and with it came memory. Long, aching memories of sleepless nights spent with young, struggling artists, painting wooden frames by hand, mixing paints from scraps, reminding them that art wasn't made to be sold, it was made to be felt, to reach places inside people where words could not. Now those same paintings were rejected, not for lack of heart, but for lacking investment potential. His eyes caught a new notice taped carelessly on the gallery wall in bold, red print. Only artworks with investment certificates may be displayed in the main exhibit area. Ethan stared at the sign, and then he laughed. A dry, hollow sound that scraped against the silence like broken glass. Investment certificates. A phrase that didn't even exist when he was still running this place. Back then, there was only one currency that mattered: emotional truth. Now they had managed to put a price tag on the soul itself, neatly wrapped in barcodes and approval stamps. That night, after the last of the Art for Influence guests had left, heels clicking against marble floors, wine glasses still smudged with approval, Ethan returned to the second floor, mop in hand. Through the tempered glass of what had once been his office, light still glowed from Miles's laptop screen. Then she entered. A woman, tall, poised, draped in elegance. A Hermes bag dangled from her wrist, her makeup flawless, magazine cover perfect. She didn't walk into a place of vision. She stepped into a trading room. Ethan immediately withdrew into the shadows instinctively. He understood now that the room beyond that glass wasn't about art, it was about capital. But strangely, in that moment, he felt no anger, no bitterness, only the quiet sting of recognition. Some legacies do not endure. To survive, must begin again. Then came Miles's voice, low and almost confidential, muffled behind the frosted glass, meant only for those within. Don't worry. All of Ethan Rowe's early works have been moved to storage. We're just keeping his name on the website as a legacy piece, a kind of inspirational footnote. Then a short, callous chuckle, a sound colder than any insult. Good. I don't want the board seeing any more of his nobody projects. Let the market decide what matters. Ethan's grip tightened around the broom handle. His palms trembled. Not from rage, but from a pain deeper than betrayal. To be turned into decoration. A name with no presence. A relic placed behind glass, not to be remembered, but to be used. In a forgotten museum, still standing but never looked into again. And the office quieted once more. Ethan turned away and moved down to the basement, the underbelly of the gallery, where all discarded works went to fade. He had once imagined this basement as a place of preservation, a resting space for misunderstood brilliance. Reality was far less romantic. Paintings were crammed into warped metal racks, covered in dust, some bent, some nameless. A graveyard of beauty. And in that graveyard, Ethan saw something that made his breath catch. Nora Jean's painting. She was once the proud winner of the Emerging Voice Award, a prize Ethan had created and funded with his own money to uplift new talent. Now her painting hung crookedly, a red silk ribbon taped to its edge like a scar. A note scrawled in black ink read, "Hold does not meet display standards." Ethan knelt, gently turning the canvas over. On the back, her handwriting was still visible, trembling, raw. For the one who believed I could paint when no one else saw me. He collapsed to the cold cement floor, the weight in his chest heavy and sinking. He placed his hand on the edge of the canvas, a touch both apology and farewell. In the stillness of the basement, with only the humming pipes and faint buzz of fluorescent light overhead, Ethan finally understood. He was no longer the owner of this gallery. He was no longer the name on the door. He was a witness to what had gone wrong. And worse still, he was part of the system that made it happen. Under the dim yellow glow of the wall lights, the brushstrokes on Nora's painting seemed to pulse again. Still alive, still breathing, but buried, smothered by a system of algorithms, investments, and sterile language that called itself cultural preservation, but was in truth nothing more than repackaged commodification. Those pieces weren't rejected for lacking talent. They were rejected because they didn't know how to sell themselves. And in that moment, something shifted deep within Ethan Rowe. His old role had died, but from the ashes of that death, a new purpose was born. He wouldn't rebuild the gallery. He would reclaim the soul that once filled it. At exactly 7:30 p.m., the gallery's central announcement system came alive with a soft chime. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The official presentation will begin in 2 minutes. Gentle white lights washed over the pristine white walls, casting a soft, breathing glow on the paintings. They shimmered under the ambient glow, each frame catching light, like a silent performer waiting for its cue. But what stopped the crowd in their tracks wasn't the artwork. Not the paintings nor the champagne trays or perfectly spaced lighting. It was something that wasn't supposed to be there at all. Tucked between the two main exhibition wings stood a modest, hushed corner, a display not found on the floor plan. There was no artist's name, no investment label, just a white cloth backdrop with a single handwritten phrase in black ink. Whose frame is it really? At the center of that humble space stood a painting titled Hollowed Skin, credited in full to the original artist, Elias M. It was accompanied by a small photo of him, a brief handwritten description of the piece, and a printed excerpt from an old email he'd once sent to Lumen Gallery, dated 3 years prior. If I'm not enough to be seen, then my painting shouldn't hang anywhere. Miles froze. Color drained from his face. He turned sharply toward Veronica, his voice barely hiding its panic. Why is this? Veronica shook her head, already dialing someone backstage, but before she could speak a word into the receiver, the lights shifted, the room dimmed, a single spotlight redirected, and then a voice echoed across the lobby. Deep, clear, not loud, not angry, but so certain that it pulled all sound from the room. I'm Ethan Rowe, the man whose name you now only find at the bottom of this website. All heads turned. There, in the corner of the room, was a makeshift stage no bigger than a storage crate, and on it stood a man rising slowly from a plain wooden chair. No introduction, no music, no podium. Just Ethan, wearing a faded overcoat, scuffed leather shoes, and a gaze that cut through every artificial layer this space had accumulated over the years. A gaze that remembered everything. I once believed that art was truth, a kind of truth that couldn't be bought, couldn't be sold. And I once believed Lumen Gallery was a sanctuary for honest dreams. A place where you didn't need a designer suit or a $20,000 0-cents watch to be seen. He paused, his voice hanging like a prayer in the air. Miles attempted to regain control. He stepped forward, forcing a diplomatic smile. Mr. Rowe, if this is some kind of artistic performance, perhaps we should allow the official ceremony to resume. Ethan's eyes locked onto him, unblinking. Resume from what exactly? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were sharp enough to silence even the clinking of champagne glasses. From the moment you authorized the transfer of intellectual property without consent, from when Veronica created personal investment portfolios with unreported profit splits, Or was it when artists like Elias M. were erased from their own captions, while their work was revalued by a board that never once stepped foot inside their studios? The room shifted. The silence was no longer awkward. It became sacred, a witness. Then Ethan gave a subtle nod. From the far side of the room, a young woman stepped forward, carrying a tablet. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't waver as the screen behind her flickered to life. A side-by-side comparison appeared. On the left, the original artworks, complete with artist notes and signatures. On the right, the versions currently hanging under fabricated names, stripped of context, polished for investors. A spreadsheet followed, columns of numbers. A breakdown of profit margins made possible by renaming and rebranding. In some cases, profit increased ninefold, just by assigning the painting a new European-sounding name and marketing backstory. Juno steadied her breath. This is the system Lumen is now running. A system that turns creators into nobodies, while asset managers become artists, but artists of manipulation. A ripple moved through the crowd. A journalist from Art Now raised a phone to record. An older collector standing near Veronica whispered aloud, "I remember that painting. I saw it at a student exhibit back in 2019. You told me it came from Zurich." Ethan walked slowly toward Veronica, who now stood motionless, clutching her iPad like a shield. "You once said to me, buyers don't care who painted it, they only care who's selling it." He tilted his head slightly. "Maybe you were right, for a while. But truth doesn't need to be introduced. It reveals itself, like it did tonight." And just like that, the room fractured, not in noise, but in realization. 1,000 small cracks spread across the polished veneer of the gallery's pristine image. Not because of a scandal, but because something true had finally spoken. Miles remained frozen, every ounce of practiced charisma now stripped from his frame. Veronica took a step back, her face pale, smile frozen, scanning the crowd like a trapped animal. Then Ethan reached up and removed his cloth cap. Silver hair spilled out beneath it, the ears written into his face. A face once printed in brochures during Lumen's golden years. "I'm not standing here to reclaim a title. I'm standing here to reclaim the names that were buried. Names dismissed for not fitting market trends. Names pushed aside because they didn't paint what was profitable. Names that were never seen because the gatekeepers never bothered to look." Then came the final blow, not of anger, but of justice. Ethan had quietly redirected every cent of profit ever made from misrepresented works into a new fund, the Foundation of Restored Expression, a nonprofit co-founded by the very artists who were once erased, each with equal voting rights, no boardroom, no power hierarchy, just collective voice. Simultaneously, his legal team began working with independent art protection groups to dismantle every fake certificate Lumen had ever issued. There was no press conference, no red carpet, no PR spin, just a single video, 9 minutes long, filmed on a phone. It's titled, "Gallery Owner Publicly Apologizes, Rehangs Paintings by Hand." The video showed Ethan wearing his janitor's coat, quietly hanging a painting by a Latinx artist on the wall. No speech, no audience, just the artists, standing behind him, weeping softly as she saw her name on the label, for the first time in 5 years. In the viral video that swept across social media, there were no dramatic speeches, no music, no branding, just a single frame. Ethan Rowe, in a faded maintenance uniform, quietly hanging a painting by a Latinx artist whose name had been erased from Lumen Gallery's records 5 years prior. No spotlight, no ceremony, only a single tearful breath from the artist, who stood behind him, silent, until the moment she saw her name printed clearly on the gallery label. for the first time in half a decade. That name didn't just represent authorship, it represented existence. In the first week after Lumen reopened, visitor attendance tripled compared to the same period the year before. But these visitors weren't there for press, prestige, or investor buzz. They came for something else. They came for something real. For the first time in years, the gallery held a feeling so raw, so unfiltered, that it made people cry without understanding why. The people who filled the lobby weren't dressed in haute couture. They wore old sweaters, denim jackets, canvas sneakers. They carried tote bags, not clutch purses. They came from classrooms, construction sites, city buses. A high school teacher from Brooklyn brought her entire senior art class to see what honesty looked like hanging on a wall. A war veteran drove 90 miles from Jersey just to stand before a single painting. Stillness After Noise, by Vietnamese-American artist Duy Inu, whose funding had once been denied because his work was considered too culturally niche for the local market. And now he was the one delivering the opening speech at the first community dialogue in a new series titled Meeting Yourself Through the Frame. His voice was calm, grounded. There's nothing more painful than being told that your story isn't worthy of a wall. But today, I don't have to prove that anymore. Thank you for hanging me back up. The audience didn't applaud immediately. They breathed, as if the room had exhaled for the first time in years. Up on the third floor, once an exclusive area reserved only for elite art consultants, walls had been knocked down. That space was now reborn as an open community studio, welcoming anyone, anytime who wanted to paint or learn. No applications, no portfolios, no name dropping. Just one question printed above the door. Do you still love art? Juno, who once worked in obscurity as the gallery's archival assistant, had now been appointed Director of Community Programs. She launched a new initiative called the Wall of Firsts, a dedicated space for early sketches, smeared lines, unblended colors, and unfinished canvases, the kinds of raw beginnings that galleries usually hide to protect their polish. But this wall didn't hide them. It celebrated them. One afternoon, Ethan stood before that wall. His eyes welled with tears when he recognized a weathered scrap of paper in the center. His first sketch, drawn when he was 18, back when he studied at a local trade school, before he ever dreamed of founding a gallery. Juno had found the sketch in a storage box labeled "to discard." But she didn't toss it. She framed it and gave it the centerpiece spot. Not because it belonged to Ethan, but because it was the first time someone dared to dream. And beyond rebuilding physical space, Ethan began a quiet mission. He wrote personal letters by hand to every artist who had been rejected, erased, or left behind by the gallery. No templates, no polished branding, just ink on paper and memory. Each letter an apology from a man who had lost too many faces among too many spreadsheets. By the end of the second month, something unexpected happened. The same investors who had once walked away began returning. But they weren't asking about market projections. They weren't there to set prices or claim seats on boards. They came to ask one question: can I help a young artist buy their first set of paints? In response, a new grassroots fund was born. In Canvas again, a completely transparent micro-grant program where every dollar went toward materials, shared workspaces, and exhibitions for names that had never been displayed. There were no plaques, no sponsorship walls, only a handwritten note next to each piece. From someone who believes in your story. This shift didn't happen because of collapse. It happened because of courage. The courage to pause, to apologize, and to begin again. Ethan gave it a name: restoration through restitution. At a weekend workshop, a 12-year-old girl raised her hand and asked, "Uncle Ethan, what's the biggest mistake you ever made?" He smiled gently and bent down to her level. He looked her right in the eyes and said, "Forgetting that art doesn't live behind glass. It lives in the eyes of the one who creates it. And when those eyes go dim, even if we hang a painting in the Louvre or the Tate Modern, all we're really hanging is emptiness." The room fell completely still. Then slowly, one person clapped, then another, and another, until the space filled with applause, not loud, but full of something deeper than volume. Truth. That evening, after everyone had left, Ethan stayed behind. He walked through each room, turning off the lights one by one, his fingers brushing every switch like a quiet act of gratitude. As he neared the exit, he paused before a small painting near the floor. The unsent letter, by an anonymous artist who had once submitted and never returned. Pinned beside it was a new label, handwritten, "Invitation to reconnect, sent. We're still waiting." Ethan didn't know if that artist would ever come back, but he knew one thing. Lumen was no longer just a gallery. It was now a sanctuary for unfinished stories, a place where silence was no longer the absence of voice, but the presence of waiting. Thank you for walking with us to the end of this journey. A journey not just about fixing a gallery or revealing corruption in the art world, but a story that reminds us, even the most perfect systems hold cracks. And it's through those very cracks that the real light gets in. Ethan Rowe, the former gallery owner turned janitor, he was never a hero from some novel. He was simply someone who had once forgotten. Art doesn't exist to enrich those who price it, but to nourish the souls of those who ache to be seen. And when he returned, not with hands cleansed by power, but with hands stained by humility, when his gaze lowered to meet the eyes of those once rendered invisible, that was the moment the system, once thought untouchable, began to tremble. Maybe you've been rejected simply because you didn't match a market trend. Maybe you buried your creative dreams because no one wanted to exhibit a painting without a brand name. Or maybe more simply, you once stepped into a gallery and felt like you didn't belong there. If that has ever happened to you, this story was written for you. Price isn't an answer, and it's an invitation. You have every right to write the next chapter of the art world. Not with money, not with status, but with your presence, your truth, and your choice to believe that art still belongs to the soul. If something in this story stirred you, if something made you pause, reflect, or remember a part of yourself that was quiet for too long, tell us what resonated with you, what made you feel seen, or maybe made you realize how often you haven't been. Have you ever witnessed injustice in the art world or anywhere else? Share your story, because maybe, just maybe, your truth could inspire the next episode. Write down what you think, what you feel, and what you believe the world still needs to hear. And if you find this journey worth continuing, please subscribe and turn on notifications here at Moments of Quiet Truth, where we don't just tell stories, we repaint a world where truth, courage, and compassion are never framed behind glass. Because in the end, we are not just spectators, we are the ones holding the brush. Thank you for bleeding. We'll see you in the next story.